I'll mention also, even before mentioning the date, that it has started to rain here, so hopefully that ends up being okay. In any case, today is May 31, 2018, and we are in the Feast of Unleavened Bread of the second scriptural month, and we are continuing on the same topic that we discussed during the Feast of Unleavened Bread first month, that being the historicity of the Exodus, with the purpose in mind of seeing how this topic relates to the character of our Heavenly Family. So before getting back into things, let's ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. Heavenly Family, thank you so very much for guiding us step by step through all the messages that you've sent. And thank you for your promise of continuing to guide us and to accomplish this work which you started. Please help us to cooperate with you to that end, and help us in tonight's meeting to be able to have any misconceptions we may have on this topic, to help them to be cleared up, and also help us to be able to see your character more clearly and more fully than at any time prior to now. So thank you so much once again. Bless us. We ask this in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
So I will briefly, again, recap where we are at and how we got here. I won't go into as much of a recap as we went through last night, since that was essentially the entire meeting. But especially for anyone hearing this after the fact who may not know exactly where we are at and why we are asking the questions we are, and so on. And also for a reminder for everyone here now, I just want to at least do a brief recap. So again, we're looking at the historicity of the Exodus. One might wonder why that would even be a question, since the story of the Exodus is told in the Bible. So why would you have to test whether or not it is historical, or if it was historical, what actually constituted its actual history? That might seem totally unnecessary if we are just reading what's in the Bible and accepting that anyway. So this really brings up the need to explain why we are even doing this investigation. And really, there's a whole long journey through this, and I really do recommend listening to last night's study for anyone wanting a fuller explanation of that journey. But in short, we came to realize that the idea of a biblical canon is not an idea to which we can justifiably subscribe. And some of the implications of that are that we need not only to be willing to accept the validity of writings outside of biblical canons, but we also need to be willing to question the legitimacy of writings within biblical canons. And this includes questioning certain claims about the writings themselves, and also the claims that the writings themselves make. So two different things: claims about writings that are made external to the writings, and then claims from within the writings themselves. When it comes to the Torah, otherwise known as the Pentateuch, otherwise known as the 5 books of Moses, these first 5 books of the Bible are often thought to have been written by Moses. That is the claim which people make for those books, though it is not a claim which they make for themselves. And we have tested this claim to see whether it is true, and have found that, in fact, it is not. These writings, again, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, gives every indication that they were not written by Moses. In fact, they give every indication that they are a combined version of several originally separate writings. And modern biblical scholarship has found that really it is composed of 4 primary originally separate writings with the addition of smaller fragments of other texts. But largely it is composed of 4 writings known as J, E, P, and D. And I won't go into explaining all of what those letters indicate and explaining the fullness of the idea that the Torah is a combination of those 4 documents, but this idea is referred to as the documentary hypothesis. Of course, last night we explained why it would perhaps better be called the documentary theory in a positive sense. But looking at this idea has really led us to realize that within the Torah itself, there are several different Exodus stories. And while they do agree on a number of points, they also disagree on a number of points. And we need to find out the truth, whatever it may be. So not only do we want to know the truth for the sake of history, but realizing that the Exodus is an event in which it is claimed that Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel, acted, and that the actions attributed to Yahweh are sometimes of a morally deplorable nature, we see the relevance of this topic for understanding the character of our Heavenly Family. In the Feast of Unleavened Bread of the first month, we focused most of our attention on a song contained in Exodus 15 called the Song of the Sea, because many scholars consider it to be the earliest account that we have of the Exodus. And so that's a natural starting place for our investigation. We have not concluded our investigation of the Song of the Sea, and perhaps we will get more into that again. But there are many, many facets and many directions to this whole examination of the historicity of the Exodus. And really, I think a good way for us to go is to see where people are at in their thinking regarding this issue. In many of our studies, since they've only been an hour long, and we will continue to have our studies to an hour long during the feast at least, but generally it's been nice to kind of keep it to around an hour for all of our meetings. But this sometimes affords less time for discussion. So if you guys are up for it, I would love it if you could kind of relate to us your current state of thinking regarding this whole discussion and investigation of the historicity of the Exodus and how it relates to the character of our Heavenly Family, and if you have done any research into it in your own time, what you have found or what you think is a good direction for people to look into, or certain aspects. I think it'd be good to kind of have us all see where we are at. So, with that said, does anyone have any comments along those lines? Well, since no one said anything so far, I will rephrase the question and I will also broaden it a little bit. And hopefully, I'm hoping for some interaction on this, but basically, I'm wanting to find out from all of you where you're at in terms of your thought process regarding the Exodus, uh, whether it's historical or not. If so, how do you view it? Do you have any conclusions? Are you totally an open book in regard to it as, at the present time? Are the things that seem more or less likely? And how does this whole topic uh, kind of impact how you look at the character of our heavenly family? And do you see any areas of study in relation to this that you think are promising? Like, have you looked into this on your own and seen, oh, this aspect perhaps seems historical, or maybe this particular writing or this section of writing has some relevance, or maybe you've looked at the archaeology related to the Exodus, and whatever it may be. If you've looked into it and you have something to share, that would be great to hear. Or if you have any questions regarding our approach to this subject as a whole, now would also be a perfectly appropriate time to ask. So basically, if you have something to say at all relevant to the topic, it's a good time to say it. So feel free.
All right. Hey, Trent, it's Scott. How you doing, brother?
Doing well. Glad you're on.
I'm glad I'm on too. I've been looking into Richard Friedman's work as well as some other guys that were at some sort of a gathering, and all of their separate speeches and sharing with each other are on YouTube. And right now, looking at it through their eyes, I can't say that I don't believe any Exodus didn't occur, and yet I do get the overall impression at this stage of looking into it that the numbers that seem to have been given and considered for so long just do not seem likely. One particular gentleman, I don't remember if it was Richard or one of his colleagues, said, if so many million of Israelites came out of Egypt, then when the first Israelites entered into the land of Canaan or thereabouts nearby, there would still be Israelites in line back in Egypt. And clearly that's not an option with the way it's drawn out. And I remember you had mentioned something else that they had discussed a while back, I think during the initial Passover that we just went through, in which if 40 years of people are living out in the desert, it should be rather fertile due to their dung and what have you. It seems like because of prophecy that something happened, because it's written as if the Exodus shall happen a second time, and that is, directly relating to the kingdom physically being set up and us being brought there and other people having that highway to enter into it as the second fruits. So it seems like something happened, but right now, where you're asking like where I'm at, I'm sure something happened. I have no doubt that Moses was alive. I have no doubt that the power of God took them from one place to another. But slavery doesn't have to mean exactly whipping people. Today, right now in America, people are enslaved, and it's all done in the mind. And people could have most definitely left Egypt to go to Israel with the glorious power of the Lord leading the way. But what if it wasn't all the Israelites? Or what if the amount of Israelites that were there that did leave aren't nowhere near what they used to be. And much like a tall fishing tail, the farther away you get from the actual catching of the fish, the grander the tail is. Between that possibility, being human beings being what we are, and the documentary hypothesis, then you get multiple people spinning multiple weaves of the same basket, and then somebody decides to put them all together, and it's a mashup. I feel much like I'm in the middle of a fluctuation of information concerning Scripture anyway, and this is an excellent example of how I feel. Where I'm at right now is I don't know if I have any business hanging on to too many details, because I don't know what's going to change next. What I do know is God's alive. There were not these people in the land of Canaan, and then there were these people in the land of Canaan. And there has been a line of prophets and prophecies given over thousands of years. And beyond that, I'm still very much tuned in to see what comes next.
Well, awesome. Yeah, I really enjoyed hearing kind of your current place on this. I'll just mention it is raining kind of heavier here, and so it'll probably work best for us to go on mute again, and maybe someone else can pick up and explain where you're at in regard to the Exodus and our whole topic related to it. That'd be great if someone else could share their present thought process.
I just want you to know that I can still hear you pretty well, but in regards to what Scott just said, that was really good. I agree. I feel the very same way about all those things. I remember you bringing them up, Trent, in past studies, and just like, oh my, there's so many, like I said, so many years passed and people told the story so many times, and all you have to do is just sit in a circle and whisper something to one person, and they whisper it. By the time it goes around the circle in real time, it comes back different, so they say. I don't know if I ever played that game. I think I might have as a kid. But so we know that that's a huge possibility, and it was just extremely interesting. I have not finished any of my books, but I've looked through several of them. I bought books that I want to continue reading what different ones have said, especially Friedman's books. And then I'm not home, and I'm not going to be able to comment much after this. But what is the name of this other book? I think it was Who Were the Israelites and Where Did They Come From? I think that was the name of it. Are you familiar with that, Trent?
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe you're the one. Well, you're probably where I got the title from anyway. So anyway, I have that one too, and I have the Exodus, and of course I have a lot of the other Friedman books. So, man, there's just a lot to listen to on audios and this and that. But you wanted to know if people were open to all this, and I'm completely open to it. It's quite a relief, in fact, because it was very confusing and is confusing for children. I mean, it's confusing for adults, let alone children. And I have distinct memories of not understanding why I had to believe these things when they didn't all match up. And I didn't even pick up on all the mistakes. So it was just there. But I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody else has to say, because I didn't really have that much. But the facts are facts. I think one of the biggest things that jumps out at me is the amount of people that we've been told passed, and how they would have still been back in Egypt. It's just, when you put a pencil to it, it doesn't make sense. And we don't have to be embarrassed to do these studies. I've had somebody fairly recently say something derogatory about that. And no, it's actually what we should be doing in the right manner and searching in the right way with the right objective and the right spirit. So I'm all for it. And that's it. Thank you.
Hey, I'll also just briefly add here that the conference that Scott mentioned, I'll probably post a link to it again in the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook group after the meeting, but you can find it on YouTube just by typing in UCSD, which is University of California, San Diego, UCSD, Exodus Conference. If you type that in, you'll find a playlist with all of the videos, and it's basically just getting together world experts on subjects related to the Exodus that are all contributing some sort of knowledge that may have a bearing on the whole question.
Was it a 2013 conference?
I guess it was 2013, yeah.
Because there's an
right.
Exodus conference from 2017 as well, just that pulls up by that search.
Okay, interesting. I'm not familiar with that.
Cinema Ministry Studio. It's a different.
Yeah. It'll be on the YouTube channel CalitTube. So Cali, yeah, CALIT, and then the number 2, UBE. So this is like California Tube. So it's anyway, it's world experts, Egyptologists, archaeologists, sociologists, biblical archaeologists, biblical scholars, historians, oceanographers, geographers, all sorts of different people, all with some sort of expertise that is relevant to the field. And so it's a really, really great series, a whole conference full of lectures of people voicing different perspectives on the issue. And I certainly haven't gone through all of the lectures, but I've gone through some of them. And today, actually, I was going through a bit more. Also, if you're like me and you don't have a whole lot of time, just so you know, there is a feature on YouTube where you can play videos at faster speeds. So you could watch it in double speed or in 1.5 or 1.25 the speed and that sort of thing. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that so that you guys can find it, and just as a reminder that I'll probably be posting it after the meeting. So if anyone else would like to share their current thought process on the subject, please do jump in.
With regards to Richard Elliott Friedman's book called The Exodus, right? His consensus is that it was just the Levites that came out of Egypt. And I've read his reasons, and I could see, the logic of it, where, only the Levites were the ones that had Egyptian names, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I'm still trying to figure out and look into it to see, if that's historically correct. And I don't know if this is wrong, but the first thing that I was looking for was evidence and other sources that would indicate that. Now, I looked into the Book of Jubilees, and what I'm coming across, it keeps talking about the story is when Joseph's brothers came into the land, right? When there was a famine in the land, and it named all the brothers that were there. Of course, it wasn't just the family of Levi that came. So I don't know. I'm just kind of having a hard time with that. But that's the only thing I have under my belt. So are we going to delve into this topic of just the Levites coming out of Egypt, as Richard Elliott Friedman thinks?
Well, that's definitely a hypothesis that's on the table for sure. And in one of the earlier studies in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, in the first month, we did kind of go through, I listed the evidences that he put forward in favor of that hypothesis and explained the hypothesis and that sort of thing. So hopefully people have it generally in mind as to what the idea is. Ultimately, though, in order to get to the bottom of it, we need to test it according to the sources. For something like the Book of Jubilees, we would have to be able to establish that it is actually a valuable source in regard to the Exodus. So, for example, if most scholars are correct and the Book of Jubilees was actually composed sometime in the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, and if it is actually dependent on the Pentateuch, well, then it doesn't actually have anything really to add, and it's not a primary historical resource on the Exodus. It's just giving an interpretation of the sources of the Exodus. So that's kind of, it might not really have historical information that would be of use in a historical investigation of the Exodus. Again, that's if most scholars are correct in their assessment of the Book of Jubilees. And, basically in order to use it as a historical resource, we have to show that it has value as a historical resource in regard to the topic at hand. So that's the first thing, because let's keep in mind also that let's just say that someone today is telling the story of Jacob and his 12 sons and, the whole story that we have going into Egypt and with Joseph being sold into slavery, et cetera. Well, we wouldn't use that as an indication of what actually happened, because this is someone who's basing their knowledge off of centuries upon centuries of people telling the story. Well, if the Book of Jubilees comes from the 2nd century BCE, that's all it is. It's a telling which is based off of centuries of storytelling, largely based on what we have in the Pentateuch. So, that's open, of course, to be questioned. That scholarly consensus is by no means immutable. It can be put to the test, but that's how we have to deal with our sources. Anything that's proposed as a source on the Exodus, first we have to legitimize it as a source on the Exodus. So I know that that's only one aspect of what you were mentioning. The other aspect is Richard Elliott Friedman's overall hypothesis. But does anyone have any comments or questions in regard to what I just said or what Anna just said?
Okay, so since we're placing, are we placing the Exodus around the 16th to the 12th century BCE?
That is something that is up for grabs as well, so far as I'm concerned. If anyone has any information that would help to establish the date for the Exodus, that would be supremely helpful. This is something which was discussed at the UCSD Exodus Conference. Lawrence Goretti, who was actually the president of La Sierra University and also an archaeologist and biblical scholar. So actually, hey, there we go, an Adventist in there. He gave a short talk, it's only like 25 minutes or something like that, at the UCSD Exodus Conference, in which he gave an overview of the proposed dates for the Exodus. And really, the dates range a millennium and a half. There are people who propose dates as early as around 2000 BCE, and some have proposed dates as late as 650 BCE, though most hover in the middle. Most people think that it was at around the year 1250 BCE. That's the current consensus position. The traditional position is that it was maybe around the year 1450 BCE. So there's basically everything in between that has been proposed. There's quite a number of dates. Some people say maybe around 1650, 1750, 13 something, 12 something, 1170. There's quite a number of dates that have been proposed, and it's one of those things that needs to be nailed down. Like at this point, we couldn't base anything off of the Exodus taking place in 1250 or 1450 or 1650 or whenever. We couldn't base anything off of any of those dates without first establishing the date. So anyway, I don't know, Anna, if that kind of, you mentioned the whole thing with the date. I don't know if you have any comment in reply to that brief overview that I gave, or if anyone else has anything to add to that.
Yeah, I guess it's just looking for sources that are older and do not rely on the Pentateuch, like if the Book of Jubilees is one of them. So different sources, I guess we need to start delving into. Any tips on which way to go?
Well, hey, I mean, looking for more sources is one thing, but there's also just dealing with the sources that we do have before us. So it's like, part of dealing with sources is comparing them. So that's why it is a good idea to have as many sources as possible ahead of time. But it may be difficult to find other sources. Like, so far as I know, what we have in the Pentateuch, those sources do constitute our earliest sources on the subject. But then there's also, other references, like in Isaiah, it talks about the Exodus. So that's going back to the 8th century BC, at least for the first however many chapters of Isaiah. So that can be viewed as contemporary, let's say, with the P source, roughly contemporary. So that's another source, and it does mention the Exodus. Jeremiah could be viewed as roughly contemporary with the D source, and it also mentions the Exodus. So these are other contemporary sources. Most scholars say that the earliest Israelite writings are actually poetic writings rather than narrative writings. And so looking at the Psalms and seeing, well, do any of these mention the Exodus? And when can those particular Psalms be dated? Because, of course, it's not like once Israel started to write narrative histories, they stopped composing poetry. So some of the Psalms are certainly to be dated later. Like, for example, Psalm 137, it has to come from the Babylonian exile. That's when that has to be dated. So that's, of course, much later than the Exodus or even the sources in the Pentateuch. So those are all different aspects to consider where we can look for sources within the canon. It doesn't have to be stuff that's outside of the biblical canons, although that would be perfectly fine as well. But Psalms should be made use of, looking at Isaiah and Jeremiah, also perhaps Hosea and Amos, some of these other early prophets of Israel, in their writings, or at least in the writings that are attributed to them. There are some references to the Exodus, and so we can include that in our source material. Again, though, if the Exodus is to be dated at some time like 1200 BCE or earlier, all these sources then do still come quite a ways after the fact. This is why we started with the Song of the Sea, because it is apparently a very early source. So the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, the Song of Deborah in Judges 5, which, while it is not an Exodus song, it is one of the earliest things in the Bible. And, we also have the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, which is also understood to be very, very early. It would be interesting to investigate that in relationship to the Exodus. So what you're getting from that is that, well, not only do we have the sources JEPD and the other sources that were included in the composition of the Pentateuch, but we also have sources which are used by and embedded within the Pentateuchal sources. So obviously, let's just say if J includes something as a source, the Song of the Sea, for example, then the Song of the Sea must be earlier than J. So J, while it itself is one source, it contains others. So that's pretty important for historical investigation. And in this light, I will actually list here several other potential sources from within the Pentateuch. There are 6 documents mentioned in the Pentateuch for which the Pentateuchal sources claim Mosaic authorship. And 5 of those 6 are actually quoted within the Torah, and they may actually be quoted in full. Now, I'm not saying that Moses actually did write all of these documents, but these are documents which the Pentateuchal sources quote and or refer to as having been written by Moses. And so if we are open to that possibility, which of course we should be, then these documents do become quite important for historical investigation. So the first of those sources or potential sources is mentioned in Exodus chapter 17, verse 14, which is part of the E text, and it refers to, well, it's actually kind of complicated with this issue because it's not entirely certain what it's referring to, but it's saying that Moses wrote something down, and it can be interpreted in a couple of ways. It could be saying that Moses wrote down the story of the defeat of the Amalekites, which is just referenced within the context. Or it could be saying that Moses wrote down a declaration, which is basically the second part of Exodus 17:14, which says something like, I will blot out Amalek forever. So is it that Moses is claimed to have written that short declaration, in which case it is quoted, or is it that Moses is claimed to have written down the story of the defeat of the Amalekites, in which case it would not be quoted in this passage, but would be a source for the story of the defeat of the Amalekites referenced in Exodus 17:14 and surrounding context. So anyway, that is the first place in the Torah where we have it claimed that Moses wrote something, and that is the something. Again, those two possible interpretations. The next possible source that has some sort of relevance for the Exodus is something also referred to by the author of the E source, and it's referred to in Exodus chapter 24, verses 4 and 7. And it's referring to, it basically quotes this document. And exactly the parameters of that quotation is something that is, possible to dispute, but it may be Exodus chapter 21, verses 2, all the way through to Exodus 23, verse 19. That's kind of the minimal amount that it would be. It's at least that. Or it could be as broad as Exodus chapter 20, verse 22, through Exodus chapter 23, verse 33. So it could be a narrower section or a broader section. In either case, it's at least the narrower one. This is a document that is quoted by the e-source, which the e-source attributes to Moses. So if the e-source was written in, let's say, the 10th or 9th or 8th century BCE, and it's quoting this other text, well, then this other text must predate the composition of the e-source. And this is something which Mosaic authorship is claimed for this text by the author of the e-source. So that, of course, would need to be tested to see if it's legitimate, but that is a claim. The next text, which refers to a document that is claimed to have Mosaic authorship, is referenced in the J text, and it is in Exodus chapter 34, verses 27 to 28. That's where the reference to the text as having been written by Moses occurs. And it's actually J's account of the Ten Commandments. And the text, which would evidently be the source quoted by J, is found in Exodus 34, verses 14 to 26. And J claims that this is something which Moses wrote. In the J story of the Ten Commandments, it does not say that Yahweh wrote down the Ten Commandments. It says that Moses wrote them down. And this is actually where the phrase Ten Commandments comes from. This is where we get it. And this list of Ten Commandments is radically different from the one in Exodus 20 and also from the one in Deuteronomy 5. In any case, this instance in the J source claims this text to have been written by Moses, so it may be considered a source on the Exodus. Whether it was written by Moses or not is something to take into consideration, but it may very well predate the authorship of J, so that makes it pretty important. Another writing which is quoted in the Torah, which is claimed to have been written by Moses, is an itinerary list of Israel's wilderness travels. And Numbers chapter 33, verse 2 claims it to have been written by Moses. The list itself is found in Numbers 33, verse 1 and verses 3 to 49. And this is something which is attributed to the redactor or the editor of the Torah, at least in the Bible of Sources Revealed, which is Richard Elliott Friedman's translation of the Torah, color-coded. So this is, again, something which the redactor inserted, but it may be an independent source that goes back at some point. It may be an ancient source. It claims it to have been written by Moses. Again, that claim would need to be tested, but it's a source that is within the Torah. The next one is claimed to have been written by Moses by the author of the D source. and it's particularly from the first edition of D, sometimes called D1, and it references a text that it claims Moses to have written in Deuteronomy 31, verses 9 and 24, and it's most often identified as being the content of Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 1 to chapter 26, verse 15. So again, that's Deuteronomy 12, verse 1 through Deuteronomy 26, verse 15. It is by far the largest section in the Torah, which some take as being a document which is claimed to be written by Moses, even among critical scholars. Again, that's the majority view, that it's Deuteronomy 12 to 26. That's the document referred to in Deuteronomy 31, verses 9 and 24. But again, that would have to be tested to see, is that really even the text that's being referred to in Deuteronomy 31? If it is, though, then that's a large section that may be a source for the D author. Some think that this source, Deuteronomy 12, verse 1 to 26, verse 15, is actually very ancient. Richard Elliott Friedman, in the Bible of Sources Revealed, in footnotes, indicates some things that might show that certain sections are at least very ancient, such as, I'm trying to remember some of the details, but there were certain commands that seemed to presuppose some sort of setting prior to being settled in the land of Canaan and having city-states and all of that. Like, for example, some of the laws given in this writing concerning the military don't seem to presuppose a military that is a military of a centralized government, which is in a certain locale. It seems to presuppose, like military laws that assume that all Israelites may be called into military action at some point. And so that's kind of like, rather than having an Israelite army, it may be presupposing a time prior to that. So that might indicate that this is actually a text which predates the D source by centuries even. So that would be the case, of course, if this text is really the scroll that was found by Hilkiah the priest in the days of Josiah. Maybe that scroll came from a time before any of the sources were written. So that's definitely something worth looking into. And then lastly, there is one other text that is claimed to have been written by Moses within the Pentateuch. The claim is made in Deuteronomy 31, verse 22, and it refers to a song that Moses is supposed to have written. And that song is contained in Deuteronomy 32, verses 1 to 43. And that song is something which is viewed as being very ancient by most scholars. So that's another source. So there we have 6 texts mentioned and potentially quoted within the Pentateuch, which the various sources of the Pentateuch attribute to Moses. So it's worth asking, did Moses actually write these texts or any of these texts? And if so, then that would be hugely important for the historical investigation of the Exodus. And even if those texts were not written by Moses, these seem to be at least some of the sources for the sources of the Pentateuch. And to be sources of the sources means that they predate the sources of the Pentateuch and thus are important in regard to the question of the historicity of the Exodus. So that's a good starting place. I will mention that there are other texts within the Pentateuch that are sources of the Pentateuchal sources that they do not claim to have been written by Moses, but nonetheless are sources quoted by J.E.P. and D, or included by the editor. So, for example, you have in the J text, it mentions a book, which is the Book of the Wars of Yahweh. Well, obviously, whatever this book is, it was written before J, because J refers to it. Unfortunately, we don't have that, but he used it as one of his sources. So that's something to keep in mind. The Ten Commandments listed in Deuteronomy 5 are thought to be an earlier source that was included by the D author in addition to this text that we have, which most scholars say is Deuteronomy 12 to Deuteronomy 26. So this Deuteronomy 5 list of 10 commandments, it mentions the Exodus, and it connects it with the Sabbath commandment. So that's something important. Like, can we date that text, that 10 commandments version contained in Deuteronomy 5, and does it have anything to tell us in regard to the Exodus? Exodus 20, that's another list of 10 commandments. It doesn't actually connect the Exodus with the Sabbath, but it's a text which is an ancient text that's apparently not part of J.E.P. or D, but it was included by the final editor of the Pentateuch. And, does it have any sort of bearing on this topic? Maybe. It's worth testing. But if you guys look on the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook group and scroll down quite a ways, basically last month I gave some links related to this topic, and one of them actually is a Wikipedia page that contains links to translations of the Pentateuchal sources, some of them just on their own, like you can just read the J material on its own, the E material, the P material, the D material, at least according to whoever put this together. And it also lists sources used by the sources. And so that's an easy way to kind of locate some of these other sources that were sources for J.E.P. D and the redactors in addition to J.E.P. and D. So hopefully that helps to kind of, I don't know, put our ducks in a row or something. That's one of the figures of speech that people use apparently. So anyway, we are actually an hour into this. Does anyone have any brief comments or questions in relation to all of these sources that I just mentioned before we close out the meeting? All right. Well, in that case, would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Heavenly Family, we continue to praise you and thank you for leading and guiding us. And we ask that you watch over us and point in the right direction of where we must keep searching to find the truth of the Exodus so that we may learn who you really are and confirm to the world that you are the gods of love. And so be with us in this week of our study. In the name of Branch, amen.
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 So love you all. Have a good night. See you guys on tomorrow night's meeting.
Wow.
Okay.
Good night.